Hey Radio Rothbard fans, the Mises Institute has a new free book for you. Dr. Guido Holzmann's How Inflation Destroys Civilization. Learn how inflation isn't only making us poorer, it's harming our culture, mental well-being, and the moral foundations of civilization itself. Get your free copy today at Mises.org/RothPodFree.
Hey guys, this is Tho Bishop with Radio Rothbard, and if you're listening to the show, you're no doubt familiar with Human Action, Ludwig von Mises' masterpiece. This is the 75th anniversary of its publication, and in honor of that, we are holding a very special event on May 16th through the 18th, a conference dedicated to this very important book. We're going to have scholars from all around the world coming in, including Bob Murphy, Guido Holzmann, Joe Salerno, Tom DeLorenzo, a whole list of all-star Austrian scholars. Now, as a Radio Rothbard listener, we've got a special opportunity for you. If you go to Mises.org/RR raffle, that's double R, raffle, you can enter in to get a free admission to this very special conference. Also, if you're a student, we've got scholarships available for you at the event site, Mises.org/events. So I hope to see you guys there, and now enjoy the rest of the show.
Welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMaken with the Mises Institute, and with me, as always, is my co-host Tho Bishop. And it was 4 years ago this week that America experienced that, I don't know what you call it, that momentous, that alarming press conference that the Trump administration called to start telling the press about how we should close schools and people should stay at home and minimize leaving their houses and should, quote unquote, listen to all the local health authorities and do what they say. And it was at this March 16, 2020 press conference that the Trump administration introduced us to the idea of the lockdown, basically. And it was there that was the first time that the administration started giving a platform to Anthony Fauci, started telling everyone that the place to find out what's right for America is to listen to these press conferences, and people from the CDC will tell you what's important and tell you what to do. Do what they say. And it was 2 days later that California, not shockingly, started the first state-ordered lockdown. And then they just all fell like dominoes for the most part after that. Only a small handful of states ever actually resisted the lockdowns, very small states. Arkansas, South Dakota were two of them. None of the large states refused to embrace lockdowns. And this then went on for at least 6 weeks in most states, in nearly all states. In some states, it went on for years. Different types of lockdowns, school closures. The actual stay-at-home orders went away in summertime. And then they were replaced by vaccine mandates, variety of mask mandates. Schools remained closed. Mass gatherings remained illegal. And it was a remarkable thing to watch. There was very little resistance, especially early on, from the general public. And even after that, when you started to get protests in many of the states, it was just a tiny minority. I went to Colorado's protest in Denver to protest the lockdowns a few weeks after the lockdown began. You know, just a hearty few of us. It was it was nice to go out in public and see other human beings milling around, which we now, of course, know from actual science that gatherings in public wasn't a public health threat at all. But, of course, doctors and nurses at the time told us that public gatherings outside were some sort of suicide attempt, a line of reasoning that they completely reversed when asked if public gatherings were okay for Black Lives Matter protests, suddenly if you protest the right thing in the minds of doctors, then it's okay. And so if you go back and you look at the details of this event, it makes you mad all over again when you look at just how insane the country went. And you could look at how across the country, governors, this was all a very bipartisan effort, by the way, in the spring of 2020. Governors telling people to stay home, don't go to school, don't see your friends, don't do anything. If we decide for you that your business needs to be closed because it's not essential, well, guess it's closed. And the state's enforcers went along with it 100%. Police were shutting down businesses, physically removing owners, physically closing businesses, and then helping the regime revoke business licenses. Later on, cops were actively tackling people and punching them for not wearing masks, removing people from public transportation. The best thing that ever happened to the police was the BLM riots, because all this defund the police stuff suddenly made the right decide that police were heroes again. But right up until then, conservatives and reasonable people recognized all of a sudden that the police were harassing soccer moms or trying to use a playground in a public park. Police were attacking middle-aged women for using park space, and it was fine. That's just how we roll. Some health worker decides that we're going to close everything. You're not allowed to go to public parks, and then out come the cops to abuse you for trying to use what you've been paying all these taxes for years. And then things went even crazier over the summer. The question I kind of wanted to talk to you about today, Tho, is did we learn anything? Have we really reached the point where this sort of thing could never happen again? And what action has been taken to prevent it? I know that if you talk to many people, they say, oh, no, people would never fall for that again. Well, okay, well, how much time would have to pass for people to fall for it again? Maybe that's the question. Maybe 10, 20 years. But this also raised the issue in a column I wrote called the COVID crisis showed us who really rules America, or COVID showed us who really rules America. Because what the whole experience taught us was that during times of crisis and perceived emergency, you find out who really holds the power. And we found out who really holds government power. It is a small number of faceless bureaucrats. It's the executive branch, and it's their enforcers in the police departments that make sure that people follow the rules. And if you opposed all that, there wasn't much you could do about it at all. It required a long period of blowback for the public to start tiring of it, to start physically opposing the lockdowns, to get the government to ease up even a little bit. And it's really just, when you look at the details, it's amazing that it happened that way, but I think it really illustrated that constitutional government, as we think of it, didn't prevent this at all. In fact, it enabled it in many cases. And all too often, I think when we look at people who imagine the proper way to control a regime, to control regime power, they rely much too much on these parchment barriers and imagine that the courts will step in, that there will be some sort of balance of power that will keep everything in place. But that didn't happen at all. The balance of power failed completely. The courts didn't step in and still really haven't stepped in to address most of this. They've avoided ruling on most of it. And so the question is, has anything really fundamentally changed? And I don't think it has, but I think that many people have at least become more acquainted with the idea that the only way you can actually stick up for your freedom is to show your opposition very publicly and clearly, and to put up some sort of actual physical resistance. That a do not comply mentality is the only thing that's going to save you, not some Bill of Rights that seems to do very, very little. But it when you look at where we are now, it's not terribly heartening. I do not have a lot of confidence that the situation has been in any way solved, or that the ruling class has been put in its place on this.
Well, let me paint a slightly more optimistic perspective. Maybe that just comes from the Florida sunshine down here, giving me a more rosy disposition to this entire thing. But I think when we look at COVID, I think we can kind of break it down into kind of four categories that are worth evaluating. And one, and kind of the core of your article, which I recommend our entire audience checking out, is, as you mentioned, the facade of divided government being any sort of serious agitation to federal power in a time of emergency. Now, we saw as it went on, we started to see that federalist sort of dynamic click more into place with, when Georgia opened, when the South Dakota legislature, not the governor, who gets a lot of credit for this, but the South Dakota legislature preventing the shutdown of that state. When you saw, obviously, what Florida did in the aftermath, we saw that reflux come back during the process. But for the most part, we saw the complete capture of not just the government entities, but the corporate entities. This entire dynamic where you had public health officials embedded within local school districts, right? Even within red areas, just to simplify it. Again, I live in Bay County. We're about a 75-25 red-blue county. We had local, low-level, no one knew their name, public health officials advising the school boards here on the proper policies. And so the ability to very quickly weaponize and turn on a expansion, kind of an extension of the regime's agenda throughout all those levels so very quickly. Seeing that play out in real time. So this was not a federal emergency where they're coming in and sending in federal troops right again. That dynamic is something where push comes to shove going forward. The type of emergency might change. Whether it is dealing with foreign threats, whether it's dealing with whatever's on the agenda. The ability to mobilize that army that are largely come from accredited institutions, either through college education or through, just as important, I think this was highlighted as well, the leverage point that credentialing boards have for certain professions. The ability to very quickly put that into motion is a terrifying thing. And while, again, we have seen this reflex of states not only reopening up, but pushing back on things like vaccine passports, vaccine mandates, some of the push back even against some of the liability waivers or attempting to through a legal process that the federal government has created. The extent to which that carries over from crises to crises, depending on sort of the political calculations and board, the ability to, I don't think there's any we should not convince ourselves that this is a muscle that cannot be used again at any time. You have the second group, which is the communications side of it, and the extent to which alternative voices were silenced on all major platforms. I think that environment has improved. Now, obviously, there's plenty of platforms, YouTube, Facebook, et cetera, where the moment there's a point of controversy, again, this was kind of the first trial run of that. You can go even to the 2020 election, or the second story of that was the 2020 election, particularly Hunter Biden's laptop and the cartel-like behavior and silencing that. But you've seen the blowback there, where obviously you have, not that we want to anoint Elon Musk as some sort of great savior for free speech that's never going to use these powers, against dissident voices. But you've seen enough of a incentive there where, you saw growing interest in platforms that would not go along with that line. You can include Rumble, you include some of these other platforms. Again, not as large as, say, YouTube is, but there has been a market reaction to a certain extent there, as well as the success of podcasts that, the demand for alternative media has, I think, grown in the aftermath of COVID, has become far more normalized. You can see this reflected in part as with the declining consumption of mainstream news, which I think is trends that were going on before COVID, but I think definitely aided by that. I think those dynamics have made it. You can mark positive progress there, which is very important. The third component of that, which kind of is the precursor to COVID, is the corruption and weaponization of the medical industry itself. And I think that the awareness of, the absurd, anti-scientific propaganda that we got coming out, whether it is the most, vulgar and obvious examples as the definition of vaccine changing, on CDC web pages and the like. I think that mistrust of the medical establishment is continuing to last. You can see this within, vaccine rates outside of COVID vaccines alike. And, people can argue the pros and cons of that. That's for another channel. But, regardless of your opinion about the specific concerns that came out from that moment, there's no question that I think people view traditional medical expertise in a different light, or at least a large percentage of the country does. And then the fourth dynamic is the massive wealth transfer that goes back to the government acting with the CARES Act, which came into play just I think less than 2 weeks after that first press conference from Trump, where we're still dealing with the ramifications of that. Again, the largest wealth transfer, I think in that short period of time, and at least quite some time. Patrick Newman had a very good talk highlighting some of the specifics on that during our recent event on inflation in Tampa. And again, the ability to do that, again, because this goes back to that political basket, the reflex of the state to jump in and being able to give the peasants crumbs in the form of $1,000 checks while running cover for massive effective bailouts of industries. I think there's no reason to suggest that those tools have gone away by any means in the aftermath of COVID. It doesn't matter how much fraud comes out with the grants and everything that's baked into that CARES Act pie. And so from that, we can kind of identify two different categories within those four. One is the powers that the state has, and the other is the reaction that the public has had, or at least a large percentage of the public has had. And while, the extent to which that skepticism will last if the genre of crisis changes, again, the easiest way of thinking about it is, the extent to which, Republican voters, just to simplify, that are anti-giving money to Ukraine, how many of them have different views when it comes to giving money to Israel? How many of their views change when the conversation is military conflict with China? Right? These are not perfect lessons that has hit the masses per se, but I think those percentages have grown dramatically, where you have a very large, I think, meaningful, substantial portion of the American population that has a very different view of their underlying relationship with the state. They would lean into the idea that the state is their greatest threat, whereas the state itself, as that threat, has not changed at all. There's been no meaningful reforms there into how the state operates. And so I think there's reasons to have a positive reaction to the aftermath of COVID when it comes to public awareness, which goes to that, thinking about that the Rothbardian anatomy of the state analysis, the extent to which the state relies upon the perception of legitimacy of the people. There's gains being made there, but of course the powers of the state have not been reduced by any extent. If anything, this was a very successful exercise, right? The state just got just about everything they wanted out of this. Our spending level is still at 2020 levels. There's been no reaction the other way, which of course any fan of Robert Higgs or a regular reader of Mises.org would not be surprised by this ratchet effect of a crisis. But I think those are the two areas there. The state has shown that its ability to capture a crisis. You might have to deal with some protests here and there, but largely their agenda can go on as they desire. And they can rewrite history in the aftermath. The public, though, I think that broader public awareness, that broader public skepticism of what their relationship with the state is, at the very least for some period of time, has changed in a way that I think is beneficial for people that think the way that we do.
Yeah, I think the regime would be is not stupid enough to try a repeat, right, of well, let's come up with COVID-2, and we'll try all the same stuff, right? I completely agree. I don't think people will fall for a replay of that the second time around. I think, again, you're right. You'd have to come up with something like, oh, look, China bombed Guam or in some way threatened the United States. Then suddenly you've got all your conservatives on board for whatever emergency measures, whatever suspension of civil rights needs to take place then to stick it to Beijing. That seems much more likely, because I remember feeling through the COVID freakout that it did remind me a lot of the march to war that occurred after 9/11, where you had a lot of propaganda that was relentless in terms of telling you how much they hate you because you're free, right? Obvious lie. This is the reason 9/11 happened, is you're too free. And so they're just meanies who hate us for no reason. We've just been minding our business as America. So now we need to reverse ourselves. And instead of being peace-loving isolationists like we've been, we need now to invade a bunch of countries. Oh, and by the way, Iraq was somehow responsible for 9/11. We have no evidence it was, but trust me, it was. And then there was a war there. And people, they just fell all over themselves, approving the Patriot Act, approving TSA, going with whatever the latest requirement of the day was for giving up your liberties. And the media, by the way, of course, completely supported all of that. There is apparently nothing the media will not support when it comes to destroying human rights. And they were pro-war then, they were pro-lockdown later. And I suppose that is a good question. How much influence would the legacy media have now performing its same role? Because, man, was it key in pushing the whole lockdown narrative, in keeping Fauci on TV every single night, in then using social media to silence anyone who disagreed with the dominant narrative. I think one could argue there has been, at least in some areas, an ideological change. Now, this doesn't get to the heart of, does the Constitution protect human rights, which it clearly does not. However, it could be that the skepticism of the regime brought about by the regime's, I guess you could call it overreach that occurred during COVID, is in fact an important factor. And something that just kept coming back to my mind, and I note it in the article that I wrote last week on COVID and who's ruling America, was a note, a very important section in Ludwig von Mises's Liberalism, which he wrote in 1927, or at least published in 1927. And Mises makes the point that, yeah, constitutions, they're not going to keep you free. And there's no such thing as a liberal government, by which he means free market, classical liberal. Because governments, they're opposed to the idea of laissez-faire just by the very nature of what they are. And Mises notes the only thing that keeps government from taking away all your rights is opposition, is like direct, active, ideological, and more active opposition. And so this is what Mises says. He says, thus, there has never been a political power that voluntarily desisted from impeding the free development and operation of the institution of private ownership of the means of production. Governments tolerate private property when they are compelled to do so, but they do not all acknowledge it voluntarily in recognition of its necessity. Even liberal politicians on gaining power have usually relegated their liberal principles more or less to the background. And then it just goes on to say that governments must be forced into adopting liberalism by the power of the unanimous opinion of the people. That they could voluntarily become liberal is not to be expected. So if you're hoping for the government to respect your rights, you can't just elect the right people. You can't just think that some piece of paper is going to protect you. And that's very much what we saw during the COVID freakout. And I remember people emailing me when all these lockdowns were taking place. People were being arrested and ticketed for going to church, which is just amazing. the government closing down churches, right? Just imagine someone in the American Revolution getting a few limbs blown off in the American Revolution and say, boy, it's a good thing you're fighting for America's freedom because we plan to shut down all church activity someday. They would be, what the hell am I fighting for? Would be the question they would ask themselves. And they were doing it. And the response from federal courts was extremely slow and extremely limited. And a lot of state governments just went on saying, okay, well, I guess the church can open, but you can only have, say, 50 people gathered in any place, which essentially just makes it impossible for the church to function in any meaningful way. And they got away with it. And to this day, the courts, the only real meaningful ruling I saw from the federal courts on this, decided at the Supreme Court level, was the fact that the federal government cannot impose a vaccine mandate on pretty much all workers at any company with more than 100 people using OSHA. Basically, the ruling was, OSHA doesn't actually give you the power to do that, so don't do it. But that did not really close all avenues to doing something like that. The court didn't rule on that. And that's the way the court works. The court is always interested in protecting its own power and not overstepping and really, in effect, negotiating with the other branches of government as to, okay, how much can I get away with limiting your power without you revolting against the Supreme Court, as has happened historically. Jackson did it. Roosevelt did it. And so they're always trying to maintain sort of these friendly relations with the other branches, so they try to minimize their rulings a lot of time. And that's what they did with COVID. Not only did they take a minimalist ruling on the vaccine mandate, but then when these other cases on vaccine mandates, lockdowns, all that started coming up to the court, filtering upward, the court said, oh, well, okay, we got this case, but all that stuff's now, it's ended for now. At the state, there aren't any active lockdowns right now, or in the state that's being sued, there aren't active lockdowns right now. So it's a moot point, so we're not going to rule on it. So the court very carefully avoided ruling on this stuff. And so there's never been any sort of real conclusive constitutional discussion on the issue. It's pretty similar to as things were in 2019 and 2020. And nothing has really changed, certainly not at the federal level. And all it takes then is a sufficiently large emergency. The next one probably won't be a disease, but it just requires a large enough emergency then to get the public to not oppose it in large enough numbers that the government has to back off. And that's really the only thing that protected the lockdown from continuing basically forever. It's important to remember that the regime wanted lockdowns much harsher and much longer than they got them. The only reason they didn't, people refused to comply. People didn't go along with it. There was nothing in any state constitution de facto. There might have been some words written in there somewhere that prevented the state governments from keeping lockdowns going forever. But none of those were actually respected or put into place. And to get an idea of what the regime really wanted, we can look at some of the things that were said by people like Anthony Fauci and his supporters. Fauci, when asked about it back in mid-2020, was saying that let's look at his exact quote here. This was as early as April. And he was saying, if we get to the part of the curve, remember all that stuff about flattening the curve and you can't have new cases and we need to get the hospitals empty again. If we get to the part of the curve where it goes down to essentially no new cases, no deaths for a period of time, that is zero COVID deaths, zero new COVID cases, I think it makes sense that you have to relax social distancing, Fauci added. The one thing we hope to have in place, and I believe we will have in place, is this much more robust system to be able to identify infections, et cetera, et cetera. So what he's saying in April is, okay, if you get a situation with no new cases and no deaths, well, then we could relax social distancing a little bit. Does that sound like a regime that is flexible on lockdowns? What they wanted to do was zero COVID. That was their plan, like the Chinese regime. Keep everyone locked down and completely separate from each other until there's no more COVID at all. That was the plan. And then you had other people like Ezekiel Emanuel, who was this influential figure within the Democratic Party, saying that quote, realistically, COVID-19 will be here for the next 18 months or more. We will not be able to return to normalcy until we find a vaccine or effective medications. And what he meant by that is lockdowns until vaccine. No one's allowed to leave their house until you're vaccinated. And I mean, that's all you need to know about what the regime really wanted. The reason they didn't get it, not the Bill of Rights, it was just the fact that people resisted and looked like at least a sizable minority was maybe going to make itself violent and ungovernable. And that was what really worried the regime. The regime had everything it needed in terms of the quote unquote rule of law to keep doing lockdowns forever.
No, you're right. And and when it comes to civil disobedience, I think one of the reasons why the pushback, and this is what helped sow the seeds for the early adopters at the state level to reverse course, is that I think far more effective than the protests per se or the direct conflict with authorities. While those made for a lot of good viral moments, the nice thing, the advantage that this had was that it was the everyday non-compliance where people would just act normally that allowed to create that culture. Because when you start seeing more and more people in your grocery outlet ignoring the sign saying please mask up, that's what broke down the authority. Because ultimately, while on the one hand, right, we can talk about the extent to which the agenda of the state captured every level of government, the capacity for enforcement was still fairly limited. You could go after churches, you could go after certain businesses, right? You could try to go after, you knew where people were going to be gathering. You could go after their business license and the like. But in terms of going over to people's houses, the ability to go out, obviously there were attempts were made. I don't want to downplay the attempts the state made, right? Where you had, New York, requesting people to, escorting them to quarantine areas when they were coming in. And Florida tried something similar going the other way with New York and the right. There were attempts to kind of go into road policing. But for the most part, civil society, it went on in large portions of the country, which ended up fueling a very fascinating phenomenon, right? Where people recognized that my appeal to the Constitution or my appeal to the rule of law was far less effective than simply moving somewhere that was already respecting, that already had the culture, the environment that they wanted to live in. So you had massive people moving or vacationing or getting away. You had people leaving institutions like, if you had a church that were being, masked Nazis, it's like a lot of people that changed churches. They had been in that church for decades. They realized they can no longer trust the people they were sharing a pew with, the staff that they were worshiping with. And so they moved elsewhere. You had that dynamic of exit that allowed for the best form of protest in that regard. And that's the scary thing, is that when we think of other quite crises in the future that might create this coordinated corporatist dynamic, this merger of state power, both federal, state, local, and the private side of things, whether it is curtailing energy consumption or, natural gas with stoves or whatever under the banner of climate change or the green agenda or whatever, whether it comes in having cars that could be readily tracked and monitored and turned off if need be in a time of crises, whether it is something that requires even more authority. I mean, obviously within the war on terror dynamic, the biggest impact it had on the day-to-day lives of Americans, which largely went unnoticed unless you ever had reason to come in touch with it, were changes to the way the banks would interact with customers. A lot of these areas where it requires, when you're interacting with, goods and services that, can't make in your own home, that you can't have within that local economy that reflects that culture of the population. That's where, again, this ability to have the edict of the elites and enforcement there on down is something that, that's where that progress has not been made and will not be made until you see bigger pushback, not from the people, not from populations, but rather by other elites, by the Elon Musks of the world, willing to invest capital into owning, being part of that real economy. And again, Elon Musk, you could point to as one example of this coming into place. But that's a very small sliver that is itself going to be facing regulatory authorities and because the problem is that once you're dealing with something of that scale, you're a lot more vulnerable because you can be gone after far more easily, right? It's a lot easier to regulate a large entity like that than it is a local house party or a small mom and pop shop. And so this is why they want this broader economic consolidation of power, whether it's the financial sphere or anything else, because when push comes to shove, recognizing that the pure state capacity of people with badges and guns and batons is not enough to corral and control a population, particularly the size of the United States. That's where they rely upon these additional, quote unquote, private proxies. And navigating that environment is, again, luckily they make it easy when it's so obvious and petty and partisan, right? Thankfully, something like the Green Agenda is so ideologically identified now that you're going to have just kind of civil partisanship, right? You're going to see Republican politicians that they can throw out red meat to the base. That helps, and I think that's that's one of the aspects that made COVID so fascinating, right? Because there wasn't a clear ideological divide, right? You have the massive failure of the foreign policy during the war on terror. Yes, you could point to the fact that the legislature, authorized, Hillary Clinton voted with Bush on that sort of stuff. But for the most part, right, Bush was kind of made the face of the disasters of the Iraq War. And so you discard Bush, right? And it's like, oh, well, the CIA is still generally good. They made a mistake here, but you just got to trust them. Oh, well, we had all these failures there. Oh, you just got to change up the people there and it'll all be hunky-dory. It's the getting people to view these institutions not simply for the people currently in charge, but the structural power they have is I think that is one of the dynamics that has come into place in the result of COVID, and to the extent to which that can be carried over to future crises, where again, if it comes down to material goods that can be used as an additional extension of the state, that's where the concerns come in. Again, where this dynamic of the regime's power has not changed, but the perception of it has, and to what extent are people really willing to engage in, say, a alternative economy, right? You're willing to make real sacrifices when it's not just simply refusing to wear a mask or boycotting your favorite restaurant that has heavy-handed policies, where you don't have those same choices. That's the real concern I have with which is just how, again, interconnected politics and the economy is in the current environment.
Yeah, that's something that needs to be noted, and there has been no progress in terms of unwinding the issue of, well, the feds and the state governments control the money, and they can use that as a means of controlling local institutions, whether it's local government or local corporations, local schools, whatever. And you saw that. I just remember it reminded me of what happened here in Colorado, where the state, of course, received a bunch of emergency funds during COVID, but some counties refused to take orders from the governor. And Weld County, which is a fairly sizable county up north next to Wyoming, and not tiny rural, they have some actual people there in six figures. And they said, well, we're not going to do lockdowns anymore. We refuse. We're not going to enforce mask mandates. And the governor said, well, if you don't follow all my emergency orders, you won't receive any money. I won't give you your cut of the emergency funds. Now, in that particular case, I guess the county came back and said, haha, we already got our cuts, too late. You can't stop now, so we're not taking orders. But you could see, so I guess it didn't work out in that case, but you could see how the system is set up in a way that political power is centralized by the fact of who controls the money. And of course, so you have plenty of instances where the state government controls the money and so determines what local governments can do via bribery, essentially. And this is a long established federal method, right? Oh, this has happened in the 70s and 80s. You need to reduce your maximum speed limit to 55 or you won't get highway funds anymore. Or you need to increase your drinking age to 21 or you won't get highway funds anymore. It's known that the federal government could not make those laws directly, but because the courts have decided they couldn't, and obviously the 10th Amendment prevents it. But the idea was, we can't directly force states to do things, so we'll just not give them any money until they do what we say. And so you could see a situation where if COVID had gone on a little bit longer and if they had really wanted to double down on the lockdowns, they could have created a situation where, your state won't get any emergency funds unless you have lockdowns in place, unless you have mask mandates, unless you enforce vaccine mandates for all students, all children, all state employees, you shall receive no money. And that would go a long way in basically enforcing the federal will. And that's, of course, used in tons of different topics. But that could still be used because nothing has unraveled that system. The federal government still controls the money and allows it to filter somewhat down to the state governments, and the state governments can use power in a similar way. And so until people who oppose centralized power are willing to take some real steps in terms of decentralizing the power of the purse, they're not going to be able to address that issue at all. There will always be the issue of then just being bribed by federal dollars. And that then comes back to the issue of the central bank, right? Is basically the only reason that the whole lockdown thing didn't implode immediately was, we're the central government. We just made 30, 40, 50 million people unemployed. But here's a bunch of free money we just printed up. So now you can afford to just stay home. And you can imagine if they hadn't had the ability to just print up $6 trillion, how long would that system have lasted? People would have gotten hungry real quick and would have started revolting. And so that was just the whole Federal Reserve money printing scam that went on in 2020, just a way to bribe people to stay home. And of course, now we're paying for it in terms of the inflation, the declining standard of living, runaway housing prices. You're really feeling the brunt of it if you're just a normal person, a young person, a first-time home buyer. You can thank that money printing so you could stay home and not work and be unemployed during the COVID lockdown. That was all part of the same scam. And nothing has been done to address that issue, except that people maybe know, to your point, though, progress has been made in the sense that people know about it. They know it's a scam. At least many more people know that it's a scam than knew 4 years ago. But the question is, how do you actually enact any real change, either legislatively or constitutionally? I don't know if anyone's even making efforts along those lines, but clearly something has to be done if freedom's actually important.
Right. And that's where, I think one area where you have seen progress made is that, obviously, I'm not going to say this is true for members of Congress, but they're always the last to know. But within what we might call the conservative movement, right? The institutions like Heritage or publications out there, I think that the idea that the Constitution is going to save us, right? This kind of boomer constitutionalism, I think that is a dying force, same way that, zombie Reaganism, right, is a dying force. I think that there is a broad awareness amongst the pundit class, amongst the staffer class, amongst, again, even the think tank class, that the rule of law is limited by who is holding the gavel at the time. And there's plenty of stuff beyond COVID that is, the Trump stuff has helped that. There's a variety of things that have helped that dynamic to it. The problem is, though, is that many of these same people, not all, but many of these same people also discard or disinterested, or in even worse case scenarios, adopt explicitly bad economic ideas. So they're either economic agnostics or economically demonic. Depending on how deeply they want to dive in that pool. It was like, oh, well, the days of talking about tax cuts is out the window. Oh, well, physical restraint. Well, just everyone in Trump buck, buy the votes, whatever. And the problem is that until you separate the economic power that DC has, which, as you mentioned, goes a big part of that is the extent to which the strings attached, they buy state sovereignty through these various programs. And then the other side, obviously, being money creation, which not only fuels the what the federal government can do in their bribes of power, but also is what inflates and empowers areas like big tech, like Wall Street, like these areas, these aspects of the economy that are the most sensitive to politics. Until you break that structure, then you can fantasize about putting in your conservative Caesar, right? You can fantasize about having your guys wield the power the way that you think that power should be wielded, but you're facing a never-ending upside battle because, for one, their side already has the high ground, right? Their people already have the majority of the billionaires. Their people already have the rank and file, within these agencies. They control the credentialing boards for the medical establishment or the legal establishment or anything there that requires that. If you really want to go at it, you could even say, okay, well, let's stop talking about tax cuts. Obviously, I love tax cuts. We'd love to have tax cuts. But the structure of how these programs are funded is far more important to breaking the federal power structure than tax cuts, because if they cut taxes, they're going to put in their way anyway. So more important than federal spending itself, as big of a problem as it is and as unsolvable as it is, and go back to our episode a few weeks ago talking about how we're not going to pay back the debt, fine, whatever. But more important than the math involved is the extent to which the feds control it in the first place. And so if you adopted, for example, things like block granting out, let's say there's no change in federal spending, but you simply block grant that money out so it goes directly to the states rather than having those federal strings attached, then that does more to undermine the extent to which the federal government can snap their fingers and get everyone acting in accordance to things. And I think there is the possibility to weaponize the distrust of those people, have it percolate up through primaries in the political process, and to create a political coalition that can adopt that. One nice thing is that you don't have to have uncomfortable conversations about Social Security and all those areas that the reasons why people don't want to talk about spending cuts right in the first place, right? Too many people depend upon that spending. If you simply get serious about that structure of things, that has the possibility of doing serious harm, serious damage to the structure that the federal government has created for itself. And to be fair, I mean, it's been at least 111 years now that the federal government has been able to put in place this well-refined, very powerful machine. If we want to start 1913 as the catalyst there, Patrick Newman's book, he can give you the prologue to that still. But this is a structure that has been built over a long period of time. It's not going to be solved, one election cycle. Obviously, it's certainly not going to be solved by electing a president of your choosing in 2024. But if you can take advantage of the change in perspective that a large percentage of the population, which cannot simply be lumped in together as Trump voters, right? You think about the Joe Rogan crowd. You think about the, let's call it the more romantic left, right? The people that are genuinely angered at corruption and however they define it. That is the sort of, that is what a meaningful political change would look like, rather than playing this game of whack-a-mole where, we're fixing medical freedom. Oh yeah, we're addressing the culture war in this particular instance, right? So that they can't use free lunch programs to require you to have promote gender confirming surgeries and other forms of child mutilation. Right? I'm not saying those are not valid efforts to have in the short term, right? I'm not saying that you should cede ground on those issues, but ultimately you're going to continue to be whacking the symptoms of this much larger problem, which is the extent to which the federal power is consolidated, not simply in terms of courts and politicians and powers of war, but economically, the extent to which the federal government has consolidated its power And until you start slashing away meaningfully at that structure, then we're simply going to be living in a world where next time a crisis that can hit the same nerves as you go outside, you're going to kill grandma, right? Then the structure of the beast has not taken any real damage in terms of where true power lies, which is the ability to lock you up or finance the people locking you up.
Well, I agree with all that, and I don't really have anything to add to that. So let's just go ahead and wrap up this episode then, because I think in terms of what has to be done, that's it. I think there's been too much has been ignored on the financial side of things, just how much power follows just who's got the dollar bills. And it's still clearly lopsided, massively lopsided in terms of Fed control versus more state and local control. So they're going to end up calling the shots, even if they're not formally given the power to do all of those things that they could then bribe states into doing, or using their control of research and the media to really just browbeat states into doing what they're told. And so much of this just stems from the massive amount of resources available to the central government. And it's just very little being done to address that issue. Now, that's not sexy, but that's something that has to really be done. Not just a general opposition to government spending, taxation, that sort of thing, but all the more opposition to federal spending, federal taxation, federal resources targeted to that would be more effective than just a more general opposition to that. Because, hey, I got news for you. Most of the taxes you pay, they go to the feds anyway. You're already being exploited far more by the federal government than by any state or local entity, especially if you earn wages, at least, which is most people. So, I think that's really probably where we should just leave this. I mean, that's something that deserves our immediate attention. And of course, it's going to be one of the hardest nuts to crack. But for everyone listening, thank you for tuning into this episode of Radio Rothbard. And we'll be back next time with another episode. And I really have no idea what that'll be about, but I'm sure we'll come up with something. And however, I would like to really kind of see if there's maybe just some additional smaller issues related to COVID that we might address. And so maybe we could just do a little bit more in the future related to the 4-year anniversary as we get closer to the election. I wonder how that's going to play out, right? Are they going to try some sort of thing related to voting to change that's going to remind us of the freak out in 2020 over mail-in votes? I don't know. I guess there's a lot of stuff that we will now look through everything in the filter of what happened in 2020 and how the regime is maybe trying to repeat the successes they had at that time. But we'll find out as the year progresses. So thanks, and we'll see you next time.